In 1992, Italy nearly lost control of its own currency in a single week. Most people outside the country never noticed it happening. There were no protests filling the streets on television. There were no emergency speeches broadcast every hour. But inside Italy's financial system, something quietly broke. This story is about Italy. It is about government debt. And it is about a financial structure that still shapes daily life across Europe today. Italy has carried heavy debt for decades. That fact alone is not unusual. Many countries borrow. Many governments run deficits. What makes Italy different is how long the pressure has been allowed to build, and how quietly it has been managed. In the early 1990s, ordinary Italian families noticed small changes. Mortgage payments became harder to manage. Taxes crept higher without clear explanation. Public services felt thinner each year. At the same time, bond traders in Milan and Rome were watching interest rates with growing concern. They reportedly understood something most citizens did not. Italy's debt was no longer just a number on paper. It was becoming a constraint on political freedom. This video explains how Italy built one of the largest public debt burdens in the developed world. It explains why the problem never fully disappeared. And it explains why the consequences arrive slowly rather than all at once. If a country can function for decades under this kind of pressure, what does that say about how modern debt really works? The real beginning of Italy's debt story is easy to miss. It does not start with panic or emergency. It starts with reconstruction. After the Second World War, Italy faced enormous damage. Cities were broken. Factories were outdated. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. The government turned to borrowing as a practical tool. Funds were used to rebuild roads, ports, and housing. This approach worked at first. During the 1950s and 60s, Italy experienced rapid growth. Industrial regions in the north expanded quickly. Exports increased. Living standards improved year by year. Debt existed, but it felt manageable. Economic growth outpaced borrowing. Few people questioned the structure behind it. Politicians learned an important lesson during this period. Borrowing could deliver visible results without immediate consequences. Voters rewarded growth, not restraint. Inside government offices, debt was treated as a temporary bridge. According to archived records, long-term limits were rarely discussed. The assumption was that future growth would solve future problems. This early confidence shaped everything that followed. Because once debt feels harmless, it becomes very easy to build a system around it. The first real shift came in the 1970s. Italy was no longer rebuilding. It was trying to protect what it had already built. Global oil shocks hit Europe hard in 1973 and again in 1979. Energy prices surged. Inflation accelerated. Economic growth slowed across the continent. Italy responded by spending more, not less. Wages were indexed to inflation by law. Public sector employment expanded. Government programs grew even as tax revenues weakened. By 1980, Italy's public debt had passed 60% of national output. Interest rates were high. Servicing old debt required issuing new debt. Inside the treasury, officials reportedly began to worry about control. Each new bond sale depended more heavily on market confidence. Small changes in interest rates suddenly mattered a great deal. Ordinary Italians felt the shift in subtle ways. Savings lost value to inflation. Borrowing became expensive. Planning for the future felt less certain than before. In 1981, a quiet institutional decision changed everything. Italy's central bank stopped automatically financing government deficits. From that moment on, the state had to borrow at market rates. This single change transformed debt from a policy tool into a permanent pressure. The hidden mechanism sits at the center of Italy's debt story. It is not a single law or a single mistake. It is a structure that quietly locked spending and borrowing together. After 1981, the government could no longer rely on the central bank to absorb its debt automatically. Instead, Italy had to sell bonds directly to investors. Those investors demanded protection against inflation and risk. Interest rates rose. Debt servicing costs increased year after year. Borrowing to cover old obligations became routine rather than temporary. What made this system especially fragile was the political environment. Coalition governments changed frequently. Long-term fiscal discipline was difficult to maintain. Insiders later explained that no single administration felt responsible for solving the problem. Each government inherited obligations from the previous one. Each passed new commitments forward, For ordinary citizens, the mechanism remained invisible. Taxes increased gradually. Public spending cuts were spread thinly across many services. Nothing felt sudden enough to demand attention. This is how debt became normalized. Not through collapse, but through routine management. The consequence arrived slowly, almost politely. There was no single announcement that debt had become a problem. There was only a steady narrowing of choices. By the mid-1990s, Italy was spending more each year on interest than on education. Archived budget documents showed debt servicing absorbing a growing share of public revenue. Insiders later said this changed how every policy discussion began. When Italy prepared to join the euro in 1999, the pressure intensified. Fiscal rules became stricter. Deficits had to be contained on paper. To meet those targets, governments relied on short-term fixes. One-time taxes were introduced. Public investment was delayed rather than cancelled. Assets were sold to cover current expenses. Officials inside the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance reportedly understood the trade-off. Each measure bought time, none reduced the underlying burden. Ordinary families felt the result in small ways. Local infrastructure aged without repair. Public hiring slowed. Opportunities narrowed quietly rather than dramatically. The debt had not caused a collapse. It had reshaped priorities instead. And once that shift became normal, reversing it grew far more difficult. The escalation did not come from a single bad year. It came from accumulation. As Italy entered the 2000s, growth slowed further. Productivity lagged behind Northern Europe. Tax revenues failed to keep pace with obligations. Membership in the euro removed one old option. Italy could no longer devalue its currency to ease pressure. Debt was now locked into a shared monetary system. By 2011, global investors began to question sustainability. Italian bond yields climbed rapidly. Small percentage changes translated into billions in extra costs. Inside Brussels and Frankfurt, concern reportedly spread. Officials worried about contagion across the euro area. Italy was too large to fail quietly. Emergency measures followed. Budgets were tightened. Taxes rose. Public spending was restrained further. The European Central Bank stepped in with bond purchases to calm markets. The immediate crisis eased, but the structure remained unchanged. For Italian households, escalation felt like fatigue. Years of restraint produced little relief. The system held together, but only by absorbing more strain. The breaking point came quietly in the autumn of 2011. Markets did not wait for a formal announcement. They reacted to doubt. In November of that year, yields on Italian government bonds surged past 7%. That level had become an unofficial danger line across Europe. At those rates, refinancing old debt becomes extremely difficult. Inside Rome, pressure intensified overnight. Cabinet meetings stretched late into the evening. Draft budgets were rewritten repeatedly. The political system faltered under the strain. Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi resigned as confidence collapsed. A technocratic government led by Mario Monti was installed to restore credibility. Officials reportedly understood what was at stake. Italy needed to convince markets it could govern its finances. Failure would risk losing access to funding entirely. For ordinary citizens, the moment felt confusing rather than dramatic. There were no bank closures, no sudden shortages. Just a sharp shift in tone from reassurance to urgency. The system had not collapsed, but it had revealed its limit. From that point on, stability depended on constant external support and discipline. When the pieces are placed together, a larger pattern becomes visible. Italy was not an exception. It was an early example of a broader European structure. Countries sharing a common currency no longer controlled key financial tools. They could not adjust exchange rates. They could not rely on national central banks to smooth shocks. Debt therefore behaved differently. It accumulated quietly during calm periods. And it became dangerous only when confidence shifted. This same pattern appeared in Greece in 2010. It appeared in Portugal and Spain soon after. Different economies, different politics. The same underlying constraint. Insiders across Europe reportedly recognized the lesson. Shared monetary systems reward stability. They punish imbalance harshly and suddenly. Italy survived because of its size. Markets believed it would be supported. Institutions stepped in when pressure peaked. But the pattern itself never disappeared. It simply moved beneath the surface. If debt can remain manageable for decades and still threaten a system overnight, What really determines when stability ends? The long-term consequences are visible today, even without a crisis headline. Italy continues to carry one of the highest public debt ratios in the developed world. Growth remains modest compared with earlier decades. Archived data from Eurostat shows a slow widening gap. Productivity has lagged behind European peers since the late 1990s. Public investment has remained constrained for long stretches. This has shaped daily life in subtle ways. Infrastructure projects move slowly or not at all. Local governments operate with limited flexibility. Younger workers face fewer stable opportunities than previous generations. Debt management has become a permanent background task. Budgets are written with market reactions in mind. Policy choices are filtered through financing costs before social impact. None of this feels like emergency. That is precisely the point. The system learned how to endure pressure rather than resolve it. Italy still functions. It still funds schools, hospitals, and pensions. But every decision carries an inherited weight from decades earlier. The past has not disappeared. It has settled into the present. The final frame of Italy's debt story is not collapse. It is endurance. For more than 30 years, Italy has lived inside a financial constraint that rarely makes headlines. Debt did not remove sovereignty overnight. It reshaped it slowly. Choices narrowed before they were debated. Budgets were written with invisible limits already in place. Markets became an unspoken participant in every political decision. This is not unique to Italy. It is a condition shared by many modern states operating inside complex financial systems. Debt does not demand obedience through force. It does so through permanence. Italy's experience shows how stability can exist alongside limitation. A country can function. It can provide services. It can appear normal on the surface. Yet beneath that surface, every future option carries the weight of past decisions. The lesson is quiet but enduring. Debt rarely announces its power. It simply stays. And when a system becomes accustomed to carrying that weight, the hardest question is no longer how the debt was created, but whether it will ever truly be left behind. Italy's debt story does not end with a warning. It ends with a reflection. For decades, life continued while pressure accumulated quietly in the background. Families adapted. Institutions adjusted. The system learned how to live with limits. This is how many financial stories truly unfold. Not through sudden collapse, but through long periods of adjustment that slowly reshape what feels normal. When we look at Italy today, we are really looking at a question about modern economies. How much constraint can a system absorb before choice itself begins to narrow? If you enjoy stories like this, stories that look beneath the surface of history and finance, you may want to follow along for more. Thank you for spending this time here.